So without any further ado, I will hand over to Jackie, who can start off the session for us. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. And just to reiterate that, please feel free to ask questions or make comments as we go through. It's really helpful to get an understanding of, what how you're feeling about what you're looking at, and how you're thinking about perhaps you'll be able to use it going forward. We've done the introductions, so in a moment we'll go straight into looking at the information that you can find in your engagement area profile reports, and then we'll have an explore around those reports to look at the data that sits within them. And then we'll have a brief look at audience spectrum segmentation, because it's one of the really useful data sets that's in the report. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I'll just give you a very quick introduction to that, but there will be that session coming up where we look at it in more detail if it's of interest to you. And then at the end of the slide set, I've added some sources and resources for things that might be useful for you going on from this session in using the data. Yes, you'll have this slide set following the session, so don't feel that you have to make frantic notes about everything. It's also being recorded, so you'll have that recording as well as a reference. This is just a quick introduction to us. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Audience Agency and our work, we work right across the country with lots of different arts and cultural organisations of different sizes and governances. And our primary role is to help those organisations understand and build meaningful relationships with their audiences, including identifying and reaching out to people that they're not engaging with, but for, because it's important to them as an organisation, they really want to. So identifying the people who might want to engage. My role within the Audience Agency, I'm part of the consultancy team, and much of my work is with organisations with a visitor offer, so museums and galleries, heritage sites, and libraries as well. As we've been going through such a difficult time over the last 18 months or so through the pandemic, all of the challenges that museums faced prior to the pandemic have been really exacerbated, and it has been an extremely challenging time, and we are aware of that. And also, I think it's thrown up into even more stark need to understand audiences, particularly post-pandemic, and how they've been responding to COVID, and how that might impact on who you see coming through the door and who's engaging with you and in what ways. Some of the questions that have been coming up time and time again in the conversations that we've been having with organisations are how do your in-person visitors correlate to your digital audiences? So through pandemic, a lot of people have pivoted to online engagement, and there's been a lot of upskilling and investment in time and infrastructure to facilitate those online engagements. And I think, this is going to be one of the longer lasting impacts of the pandemic, is where people's engagement habits have changed and where they might continue to engage online, who might start coming back to on-site visiting, and how you can balance out those two. So how you can build strategies which include both digital and physical engagement. And I think digital engagement has always been there on people's lists of things that they want to look at, but it's never been at such a high priority as it has been during lockdowns, and as we emerge from that into getting back to in-person visiting. Another significant impact, particularly for museums and heritage sites, where things like secondary spend were a really important income generator, is looking at where the opportunities are to generate income. So, you know, where there might be paid for opportunities, both online and through the physical visit, to perhaps try and recoup some of those losses, those financial losses. And also how museums can understand and engage more with their local audiences and their local communities. Because again, one of the impacts we've seen is that people who are perhaps still reluctant to travel far, particularly older audiences, are now looking on their doorstep to see what they can, you know, who they can engage with, perhaps they weren't paying much attention to previously. And also I think museums have seen the role that they have played in people's well-being through lockdown, through offering those digital opportunities, and how they can build on that in terms of maintaining and building those relationships with their local audiences. So as we go through the data that we're going to look at this morning, what I'd like you to think about is, what are your burning questions? What is it that you can't answer at the moment that you think this information might help you with? And then when we come towards the end of the session, we'll have a bit of a sharing opportunity to see how you think you might start to use some of this information to answer those questions that you have. So in terms of the information that you can find in your area profile reports, there's a lot of it. And I think it's worth saying at this point that the EAPR is our most detailed and comprehensive area profile resource. There's an awful lot in it, and it's really worth taking a bit of time to explore the different data sets and think about what's going to be most useful for you. It's, you know, it's worth saying that the investment that the South East Museums development team have put into this is considerable. So hopefully it will be of use to you. And as a tool, it's most useful when it's used in conjunction with the other information that you have. So what you already know about the people that you're engaging with and your local population, because these are people that you see all the time. So that existing knowledge is really important. And looking at the data that's in the area profile report should be seen alongside that. So it's another tool in your arsenal, really, for understanding who your local populations and communities are. And also what you know about your current visitors. So who you were used to seeing pre-pandemic, who you're seeing coming back now, and how that relates to the population. So how representative are your current audiences of the people who are sitting on your doorstep or in the wider area? So you can use all of that information to inform your strategic planning and make your activities more targeted. Sorry, just trying to move on to the next slide. Here we go. So within the profile report, essentially it looks at the population within the catchment area that the report covers. And it looks at that population through a number of different lenses, including demographics, which are drawn from census data, the audience spectrum profiling, which we'll look at in a bit more detail in a moment, people's recent cultural activity from the target group index data that it brings in. And all of that is within the catchment is set in the context of a base population. And for all of your reports, that base population is the southeast region of England. And I think it's also worth pointing out that the suite of reports that SEMD have invested in covers the whole southeast region. So if you're on the border of one or another of these catchment areas, you do have access to the neighbouring report so that you can understand who's just across the border from your specific catchment. And the important thing about the engagement area profile report is it takes all of those metrics and it looks at the catchment area as a whole, but then you can look at all of that information at an individual ward level, so really hyper-local areas, which will give a really detailed picture of who those local audiences are, and who the wider what the population looks like in the wider catchment, so that you can start to balance, start to develop a balanced, targeted approach to who you might draw in from further afield, what they look like, what sort of things they might engage with, but also how to engage those people who are in your immediate area. So it's all about balancing out all of the different bits of data that you have available and layering it up. So these are the two profile reports we're going to look at this morning. So there's one that covers West and East Surrey, and the other one which covers Brighton and Hove, East Sussex and West Sussex as a catchment area. And as I say, if you're just sort of sitting on the borders of these catchment areas, there are other profile reports which give you more information about the bits beyond. So it's worth checking in on those as well. Ooh. So I'm just going to start looking at, let's look at West and East Surrey first. So this is your area profile report. This is what it looks like. And on this first page, you can see the area that it covers as a whole. And then you can also see the, oh, sorry, get to the right page. Here we go. So this is your target area. That's the area that it covers. And then you can see the ward areas that it covers as well. And then the next tab lists out all of the data that sits in this report. And as you can see, there's a huge amount of it. There's an awful lot of detail. And depending on who you want to engage and your reasons for doing that, some or other of these particular data sets may be more or less useful and interesting to you at different times. So, for example, if you're planning a family program, you can look at the family data and the household makeups that are in your area to see whether something targeted at early years or something targeted at multi-generational activities, or something that's aimed more towards older children and teenagers is likely to be more effective, because that's who's actually in your catchment area. So it means that when you're planning your activities or your messaging and marketing, you can be confident that the approach that you take is relevant to the people that you're aiming it at. So it's likely to be more effective. And you can make more effective use of the time and resources that you have available to make sure you're targeting the right sorts of audience with the activities that you're planning. The next section looks at your audience spectrum profiling, and we will come back to this and look at it in a bit more detail for those of you who aren't familiar with it. But essentially this looks at, this is a segmentation which breaks the population down by what they have in common in terms of their arts and cultural engagement. The next set of data is around what people say they've been doing in terms of their engagement. And what I would say is that because it is a personal view and it relies on people's recollection and their own thoughts about their level of engagement, it does sometimes look a little bit more optimistic than is perhaps the reality on the ground, but it's still a useful data set. So this comes from the target group index data, which is the sort of Moray poll that takes place on a regular basis. It's on-street surveying of what people are doing. And there is a separate section on museums and heritage attendance, which can be quite useful to see what people are doing in your area. So that's that set of data. And then we get into the demographic profiling, which is where a lot of the information in these reports sits. And for each section, it gives you a sort of overview of what the dominant groups are within the catchment area. So, for example, for this report, the dominant adult age group is 45 to 49. And then it breaks it down to ethnicity and health as well. So if you were looking to engage a particular community based on age or ethnic background, or perhaps you know that you have a high level of people who are at risk of social isolation, for example, through disability or something like that, you can actually see where those people are and make your approach more targeted. So this has a lot of very granular information. So I will sort of skim through it fairly quickly, but this is something you can refer to if you are doing targeted activity at people based on, any of these particular metrics. So that's all of that. And just to say, this indexing, which you will see frequently throughout the reports, just gives you the level of higher or lower compared to the base comparator. So for your catchment area, anything that's over indexing, i.e. these people are more highly represented in your catchment area than they are in the base population as a whole, will appear in red. Anyone who's underrepresented in your catchment area compared to that base population will appear in blue. And if it's more or less the same, it'll just be at that middle level. So that's just to give you an indication of what your population looks like compared to that base population. The next set of data is what is used to inform the government's NSSEC social grade classifications. So this looks at employment and qualifications, and what sort of jobs people are doing, and if they're not working, whether it's because they're retired or they're in full-time study or for some other reason. So again, lots of information there. Then we go into information about country of birth and language. And again, this can be really useful if you're thinking about a particular activity with a community group, for example, and you're thinking that perhaps some of the materials and resources, either to do with the sort of calls to action, so if you're promoting it in the local area, or the actual delivery of the activity itself, if you're thinking, oh, would it be helpful to have that in different languages, for example, you can see what sort of languages are being spoken in the particular catchment. So again, you can use any resources you have for that and be really targeted about the languages that you put it into. So that's how you might want to use that sort of information. And again, it goes into a huge amount of detail on those different things. As I was saying earlier, for a lot of museums and heritage sites particularly, the information that's in the household tab is particularly relevant and useful, because it will tell you, whether you have a significant proportion of families with dependent children living at home in your area, and therefore whether a family program is likely to, have an audience, and also the ages of those children, so you can target the activities accordingly to make sure it's super relevant for the people that you want to engage. So again, lots of detail about those life stages and household makeups. So you can see whether you've got predominantly younger or older people living in your area, younger or older families, lots of different information there. As you can see, it goes into a lot of detail But as I say, that does tend to be one of the tabs of information which is most useful for organisations who are sort of planning family offers and things like that. Are there any questions at this point? Does anyone have any questions? I was just checking the chat. I can't see any questions in there, but just to see.
Can't see any at the moment, Jackie.
Okay, no, that's absolutely fine. As I say, if you do have questions as we go through, please do feel free to shout out. Now, one of the most important things about the engagement area profile reports is the amount of detail that you get. And when you come down to these last two tabs, the counts and percentages, you can see just how powerful that is. So for all of those metrics that we've just looked at every level, you have all of that information at a ward level. So you can look in a lot of detail at what the population looks like in a very small focused area. And the importance of that is that although the overall catchment population might have a, might show particular characteristics of the people living in that area, when you look at a local level, you might find that there are significant differences in what a local neighbourhood looks like compared to the population of that catchment as a whole. So, for example, if we just pick one from here where you can see a significant difference, let's have a look. What's this one showing that we've got on screen? So in this ward, Ashford North and Stanwell South, for example, whereas this particular segment, Trips and Treats, which is a family segment, only appears at 7% in the catchment as a whole, 16% of the people living in that ward, of the households in that ward, belong to that group. So, for example, if your museum was in that particular ward, you would see that you have quite a significant potential family audience in that area, whereas in the area as a whole, it's a lot lower.
We have a question, Jackie. Sorry to interrupt. I know that you said you didn't mind me interrupting. So,
not at all.
so in the chat, we've got Shane from the Hockey Museum. He's asked, well, he said, incredible piece of work, which is great to hear. How long before this data becomes outdated, and how long does it stay relevant? A decade, or you tell us?
It's a really good question. And at the moment, all of the census data that's in there is drawing on the 2011 census. And that will remain relevant and useful for the next 3 to 4 years, when it will be replaced by the 2021 census data. And it's one of the reasons why it's important to combine the data that's in the area profile report with your understanding of your local communities and neighbourhoods. Because although change in a single street might look quite dramatic and happen over a relatively short period of time. So if there's a new housing development that springs up, for example, that is going to change what the population looks like in that area quite significantly. But in the population as a whole, change happens very slowly. So in the catchment as a whole, the data will remain relevant, as I say, for the next 3 to 4 years. But when you look at it at this ward level, it could be that a new development or changes in infrastructure, for example, might have quite a dramatic effect on that ward level data. So it's important to combine it with anything that you know that's happening in your local area, and sort of take a view then as to whether that population may have changed. Does that help? all of the other data remains relevant for as long as you're using the report, really. It's really the census data where there is a cut-off date.
Thanks, Jackie. That was really helpful.
Okay, great. So, and the other thing I think which is worth pointing out in terms of the counts and percentages is that particularly in more rural wards where the population might be smaller, even if a particular segment or a particular demographic group appear at a relatively small proportion, that might still account for a large number of people. So it's always worth double checking with the count in terms of how many households that represents. So it could be a small percentage, but still a significant number of households, which would mean it would be worthwhile programming for them or developing some activity for them. So it's worth keeping an eye on both of those two things in the more detailed information. And as you can see, there's an awful lot of data in this last bit. So really what you have is layered information according to where your potential audiences might be. So your hyperlocal audiences, literally who's on your doorstep, through looking at the ward level data, who might be in the wider catchment within a reasonable drive distance of where you are through the catchment area data, and then perhaps thinking further afield to UK domestic tourists, for example, within the southeast region, so who might be visiting you there. And that's particularly relevant for any organisations who are in holiday destinations, for example, along the coast or in other areas. So it means that you can, when you're thinking about your engagement strategies and your audience development planning, you can think about what you might do depending on who those people are, where they are, what their drivers and motivations are for engaging with you. And that sort of information is what you'll get through the audience spectrum segmentation data, which is what we'll look at after we've had a quick look at your other area profile report, which is the Brighton and Hove. So let's have a quick look at that one now. Go back to the introduction. So again, you have the map showing what your catchment area is, and then the other map which shows the wards that covers. And then all of the data is exactly the same within those tables. So it goes through the segmentation, the TGI data, demographics, employment and qualifications, country of birth and language, the household data, and then those counts and percentages again. So again, looking at where those significant differences might be in your local audiences compared to the catchment as a whole. So that's the two reports. We haven't got any other questions about sort of navigating the reports themselves or the data that sits in there. We'll go straight into having a look at audience spectrum profiling.
Sounds good. Can't see any questions at the moment, Jackie.
Okay, great. Okay. So I think it's important to sort of explore the audience spectrum segmentation because it is one of the key data sets that you can find in the profile report, and it can be really powerful in terms of understanding what might motivate different audiences to engage with you, what their needs are, what they're looking for, the routes to engagement with them, and so on. And I think for those of you who aren't familiar with working with a segmentation model, it's important to note that segmentation as a process and as a tool doesn't ignore the fact that we are all individuals with our individual needs and preferences and so on. But what it looks at is what we have in common with other people within a particular context. And for audience spectrum, that context is our relationship with and our engagement with arts and culture across a broad range of different art forms. So it looks at the role that arts and cultural engagement plays in people's everyday lives, and their sense of who they are, how important it is to them, and what sort of things they like to do. And I think the important things about the segmentation are that it recognises that everybody engages with culture to some extent or another. Nobody is completely disengaged. And lower engagement doesn't necessarily reflect a lack of interest. It's more to do with opportunities to engage, how relevant the offers are to people, and their preferences, so and the barriers they might face. So all of those play into people's levels of engagement. And the other thing about the segmentation is that it makes no value judgments about the types of arts and culture that people enjoy or their reasons for engaging with them. So the pen portrait information, which I'll show you in a minute, it's freely available online through our Audience Finder website or the Audience Agency website. And it offers a huge amount of information about what sorts of activities each of the segments is drawn to and how to reach them, and the barriers that they might face, for example. And it's a full population segmentation, which breaks up the whole of the UK population into 10 segments. And there are 3 highly engaged groups, 3 medium engaged groups, and 4 lower engaged groups. And what I would say is, don't worry too much about the names. The naming of segments is always a bit of a contentious issue in any segmentation model, really. And they're just there as a sort of shorthand to identify the key distinguishing characteristics of each group. But what's really important is to understand all of the data that sits behind the segmentation, so to sort of understand how they've been developed. So these segment portraits are based on data from and about real people. It's not based on assumption or stereotyping in any way. And it brings in some large national data sets, including the Taking Part survey, which captures information about how people feel about arts and culture and the value they place on it, and how frequently they take part in various different activities. And it also brings in Experian data, which is consumer information, and it's what drives the mosaic segmentation, which you may be familiar with. It's quite widely used by local authorities because it's essentially a socio-demographic segmentation. And it also brings in census data, and that means that the profiling can be used in conjunction with other data sets that you might have access to in terms of socio-demographic information or population information. We also ran a panel survey, a population panel survey, to inform the segmentation, to fill in the gaps that weren't, where we wanted more information that wasn't filled by those other big data sets. And I think it's also one of the key things about it is that we are continuing to test it through Audience Finder, which is our data collection and sharing platform. So we're continuously looking at the segments to make sure they are behaving in the way that we think they are. And particularly through the pandemic, that's been really useful. We've been running a participation monitor to see how people are responding to the pandemic, and in terms of their now their readiness to return. But it's a longitudinal study, so we started collecting data between the first and second lockdowns, and we're now in our 5th wave of data collection. So we can track how people have been responding through the various different stages, and also the impact of the vaccination rollout, for example, on confidence to return. And all of that information we can look at through demographic profiling, but also through audience spectrum. So you can start to build an understanding of if you have people who were in your audiences who haven't yet started to come back, you know, why that might be, whether there are some COVID impacts which are making them feel less comfortable, for example, about returning. So all of that data enabled us to segment the population, as I say, into those 10 distinct and locatable groups based on their preferences, the opportunities to engage, and the barriers that they might face. Oh, I've skipped ahead. So if we start to look at them in a bit more detail, those 3 higher engaged groups, what they have in common is that they, although they represent quite a low proportion of the population overall, they are overrepresented across almost all art forms when we look at audience profiles. So they account for a much higher proportion of audiences than they do population. And for all of these groups, arts and culture play an important part in their lives. They're all very well informed. They live within easy reach of a wide variety of different offers, and they have lots of opportunity to engage. But there are differences between the different groups. And that's why it's important to really understand who these people are in the round. So, for example, the metroculturals, who are the highest engaged group, and the experience seekers, who are the youngest segment, are both risk takers. So they're looking for things that are quite experimental. They like high profile activities and things like that. But metroculturals are more likely to be drawn to critically acclaimed work, and organisations with a reputation for, you know, high quality delivery. And experience seekers are looking for something that offers them something a bit different, a social experience, something they can share with friends. And sitting in the middle are commuter land culture buffs, who are a very significant audience for museums and heritage visiting. They're a little bit more conservative in their tastes, a little bit more traditional than the other 2 segments in the higher engaged groups. But they are the segment which is most likely to say that arts and culture is an important part of who they are. They really value access to arts and culture, and they are the most likely segment to support local cultural organisations. They're the most likely to buy original works of art and craft work. And they've also been one of the segments which has been hardest hit by COVID because they are an older group. So for all sorts of reasons, if you have commuter land culture buffs in your catchment area, and they are quite significant within the southeast region, it's important to think about how you might maintain relationships with them even if they've not returned to on-site visiting, for example. You know, they're really good prospects for individual giving and supporting organisations if you're looking at your funding strategy. And then the 3 medium engaged groups. So they're a little bit more balanced in terms of where they appear in audiences compared to how they are in the population. But they are, you know, they're the most widely represented in the UK population as a whole. They account for 41% of everybody living in the UK, and they account for 30% of audiences, so slightly higher in the population than in audience profiles. And what they have in common is that they are all drawn to more traditional offers, so things that are known and trusted, but they don't often have a wide offer on their doorstep. Otherwise, they might do more than they do at the moment. But again, there are differences within these three segments. Dormitory dependables are slightly more adventurous than the other two groups. So they are willing to try new things if they take place somewhere that they're familiar with. So, for example, they might be more drawn to a contemporary art show if it's in a heritage setting, for example. And they're regular but not frequent attenders, again, because they don't tend to have, they tend to live in areas where there's not a big offer in their local area. The trips and treats, as I mentioned earlier, they are a family segment, and again, very important for museums and heritage sites. They account for quite a large proportion of visitors to those sorts of venues. But what they're looking for is more of a whole day out package. So although they enjoy museums and heritage sites, they enjoy them as part of a wider day out, which might include shopping or eating out. And what they really value is the opportunity to have a social experience with their friends and family. And one of the greatest impacts for them through COVID has been both homeschooling, which has impacted on their finances, but also being cut off from those wider networks of friends and family, which is a big part of their life. So they're really looking now for opportunities to get out and about again and have those social experiences. Home and heritage are one of the older groups, and they have very traditional tastes, and they made up quite a high proportion of the sort of coach trip audience prior to COVID. So organisations who had quite a significant proportion of people who visited them through those kind of organised day trips may have seen a reduction in people coming through that way. But if you have home and heritage people living on your doorstep, they're much more likely to be visiting you than going further afield as they did pre-COVID. So again, that might be an opportunity to re-engage with your local audiences who might have been going further afield previously. There's quite a high level of National Trust and English Heritage membership within the Home and Heritage group as well. So again, they may be prospects for support. And then we come to the 4 lower engaged groups, and they make up a much more significant proportion of the population than they do audience profiles, and they're underrepresented in almost all art forms. And what they have in common is that they face a range of quite significant barriers to engagement, and that can be physical barriers, financial, a lack of confidence, or a lack of awareness. And I think one of the key things for these groups is that they don't tend to venture far from home because that for them is a big risk barrier, going somewhere that they're not familiar with. But also because museum and heritage and arts visiting is not part of their everyday life, there's also something about not only not knowing what to expect from a museum or a heritage offer, for example, but what might be expected of them if they visit. So if they have children and the children are noisy and running about, are they going to feel embarrassed? Are they going to be asked to leave? Is there an expectation of a certain level of knowledge and understanding of what they're going to be looking at before they go? All of these things feed into, quite big risks for them. So when you're thinking about engaging these groups, one of the things I find quite useful is to think about, when you did something for the first time, what made that experience more challenging? What made it easier? What did you need to know before you actually took part? Because I think for those of us who've been working in the sector for a long time, and particularly, if you're very familiar with your museum and what the offer is and so on. It can be really hard to think about that from the perspective of somebody who's never visited your museum and isn't a regular visitor of museums in general. So think about the really sort of basic information that they might need, and particularly for some of the groups that includes COVID safety information as well, to give them the confidence to visit. So there's lots of information that is available about all of the segments to understand what their drivers and barriers might be and how to reach them. And you can find all of that in the online pen portraits. So there are layers and layers of information available. And this includes people's interests, including what they do in their leisure time outside of arts and culture. So you can start to think about people in the round. And, if you're planning a program of activities, what are the hooks that might be meaningful and interesting to people? What their preferences are in terms of their cultural engagement, what the routes are to engage them. So, what sort of channels and messaging is likely to be most effective for them, where they are, which is really important. All of the segments are locatable geographically, so you can see where they are in your area. And also each pen portrait is accompanied by a statistical download, which shows you the segment that you're looking at indexed against other groups, like the rest of the population, across a range of different metrics. So you can identify who is more or less likely to donate to a museum, for example, who is more or less likely to volunteer their time, all sorts of different things, and it includes their media consumption as well. So are they more likely to respond to what sorts of promotional activities? So that's a sort of overview of the segmentation, and now we'll have a look at what the key segments are for your groups, for your catchment area. So in the Surrey profile, the most prominent segments are community and culture buffs, dormitory dependables, and experience seekers. And for the Sussex profiles, the most prominent segments are almost the same: community and culture buffs, dormitory dependables, and home and heritage. So already you can see that there are some groups who are dominant in the southeast region, and you'll see that reflected also in the base population in the area profile reports. So the most prominent segments across the southeast as a whole are commuter and culture buffs and dormitory dependables. But each area has a distinct profile, so you can see there is a difference between the Surrey and the Sussex profiles. And then when you start to look at the ward level, you see even more significant differences. So, for example, in the Sussex profile, in Brighton and Hove's Queen's Park ward, 41% of the population belong to the higher engaged experience seeker segment, but that doesn't feature in the overall area profile as a prominent group, but is really significant for that local neighbourhood. So again, it's really important to think about those different layers of population and what you need to know in order to target the work that you're doing at a particular group. And on the whole, if you have any more urban areas within your catchment area, so cities and larger towns, that is likely to have a population profile which is significantly different from the suburban and rural areas that are surrounding it. So yes, it's really important to understand who is in your local area. And now we'll have a look at some of those segments in more detail to show you the sorts of information you can extract from the pen portraits. And again, all of this is most useful when it's used alongside your own understanding of who your audiences are, because again, it's a tool to use in the way that's most useful for you. So community and culture buffs, as I said previously, pre-COVID were a highly significant group across all audiences and art forms, but particularly for museums and heritage. And they have always been a reliable prospect for individual giving and paid for experiences. So very important for all sorts of reasons. But they have been among the worst affected by COVID. They are an older group. Most of them are aged over 50, and there's a significant proportion who are 70 plus. So they've been at higher risk. A quarter of them are living with disability or long-term illness, which may have added risk factors to them. And around a fifth had to shield throughout the pandemic. So this has had a really high impact on their daily life because, as the name suggests, they were, frequently traveling. They live on sort of main commuter routes into larger towns and cities. So they were, very active, getting out and about. And that, that was completely lost to them through the pandemic. And the participation monitor data that I mentioned indicates that for this group, there is still a high level of not being ready to return, even post-vaccine. So information about safety measures that are in place, for example, are likely to improve confidence for them. And they have been looking for some opportunities to engage with outdoor activities. So the early reopening of heritage gardens, for example, and outdoor heritage sites has been something that has sort of boosted their engagement. So they have been visiting those sites again more readily than perhaps some of the indoor opportunities. So that is community and culture buffs. And then experience seekers, who, as we've seen, do appear in your catchment area profiles, but also maybe in those local neighbourhoods where you've got the larger towns and cities in your catchment. So this is the youngest segment, and arts and culture play an important part in their life, but as part of a social experience, they like to share things with their friends. So the sort of museum late type programming is something that really appeals to this group, but they're not venue loyal. So if you want to keep them coming back, you need to have quite a vibrant, changing program. But there's still opportunities to engage with them. They're quite drawn to sort of quirky one-off things, if that's the sort of thing that you're planning. They are one of the more confident groups in terms of returning post-COVID, even with the new understanding that's coming through. They still see themselves as low risk, and for them the risk is worth the opportunity of getting out and about again, because it's, the main impact for them has been a disruption to their social life, which has, as we know, has had a severe impact on younger people and their mental health and well-being. It's also had an impact on their financial situation. A lot of younger people in this group were working in service industries and in the gig economy, and so they've lost work or they've been furloughed for long periods of time. So that might have an impact also on their readiness to sort of attend paid for activities, or they might be just a little bit more price conscious than perhaps they were pre-COVID. Dormitory dependables are another key group in your catchment areas, but also for museums and heritage attendance. Again, they're looking for opportunities to get out and about with their friends and to socialise. They're mostly older couples and some older families, early retirement couples and people like that. So they are looking for opportunities to engage. They're quite keen post-COVID to get out and about again, despite the sort of risks. And they're a group that's been looking for some of those outdoor opportunities and things that are close to home. So the fact that you have them in your both of your local catchment profiles means that they're probably a key audience to think about re-engaging with. They may have been going further afield pre-COVID, but now they're looking for what might be available on their doorstep. So they're another group to think about for your audience development planning. Home and heritage have quite a lot in common with dormitory dependables, but they are a much older group. There's nearly all of them are over 60 and 2/3 are 70 plus. And again, almost a third have been shielding throughout the pandemic. So they have been at severe health risk from COVID, although most of them are retired. So the impact on their income is to do with pensions rather than income. And so there hasn't been much change to their disposable income. And as people who are more disposed towards having memberships and things like that, they might be if you're thinking about membership schemes or friend schemes as an income generating activity, again, this might be a key group to think about engaging with that. They haven't really engaged digitally. The other groups have to one extent or another, but this is a group who pre-COVID were not particularly digitally engaged, and that hasn't really changed. So it really is about the in-person visiting that you need to think about. And they are cautious, so they will need a lot of reassurance around any safety measures that you have in place in order to encourage them to come back. Ooh, sorry about that, skipped through that. And then although none of the lower engaged groups appeared in the most prominent segments for your catchment areas as a whole, in the Southeast generally, and also looking at the ward level of your area profile reports, up our street are one of the more significant groups for your areas. So they account for around 11% of the catchment population for Sussex and 3% for Surrey. But although that's the overall catchment, they do appear in higher proportions when you start looking at the ward levels. So I think that it's still important for you to think about them, and just to think about what sort of barriers the lower engaged groups might face overall. So again, this is a group that's been really severely impacted by COVID, both health-wise and economically. So many of them are older, so they're sort of over 50s, and almost half of them are living with a long-term health condition. So they have been particularly at risk. And even pre-COVID, they were vulnerable financially. And because many of them were working in roles which have been impacted by the pandemic, so in service roles and so on, they've had a double whammy, really. So starting with a sort of low level of disposable income, they've been further impacted by it. Within this group, there's a significant number of single households and couples, But what they look for if they are getting out and about is an opportunity to spend time with their friends and their neighbours. So they are drawn to sort of outdoor, free, low risk activities in their local areas. That's probably the best route to engagement with them. And they will need a lot of information about, what the activity is, reassurance that are no hidden costs, information about, again, the COVID safety measures that you might have in place. So I think the key thing to think about with the segments is to really dig in once you've identified who your target groups might be by aligning that with your strategic goals in terms of who you want to engage and why you might want to engage them, is to really understand them as fully rounded people and what it is that they might need in order to encourage them to engage with you, and to really layer up those different types of audience and align them with your different strategic priorities. So some audiences, if you develop them, might help you with your financial priorities. So they might provide additional income. Some of them might help you deliver on any social responsibility priorities that you have. And some of them might help you explore perhaps more experimental approaches to how you present your collections and your offer. So there's lots of different ways that you can think about your audiences, and in your audience development strategies, thinking about how different audiences are going to help you deliver on different elements of your mission or purpose. And that's something that we'll look at in more detail in the audience development sessions that were mentioned at the beginning. So now you have all of that information, how are you going to use it? So does anybody have any thoughts about how this data is going to help them in their work? Which elements are likely to be most useful to you? Any thoughts there? Ooh.
Got something in the chat from Rohan from Bexhill. So we were looking at travelling audiences along the main routes, training cars into East Sussex. Have you got any market studies from train companies to add to the data set? Something around travel?
Sure. We don't have access to specific information about who's travelling by train and who's using them, but there is information in the pen portraits about people's willingness to travel and how likely they are to travel for the right offer. So I think part of it is thinking about, if you're targeting a particular segment, what is going to make the journey worthwhile for that particular group? What is it that they're looking for? So that you can make sure that your messaging is really effective and supports them in their decision making to actually make that journey. And also you can overlay the catchment area with the mapping of where those train lines are. So again, it's about layering up the information with other data sources that you might have available to you. Philip's mentioned funding applications. Yeah, I mean, it's really useful information to inform that, so that you can demonstrate that you understand who's in your catchment area and how that relates to the activity that you're planning and what impacts the funding will have, because that's usually what people are looking at, is what difference it's going to make if you were successful in your funding application. And you can see who's particularly if you combine it with your understanding of who's visiting at the moment, you can see who is underrepresented in your visitor profiles compared to the population. Absolutely, I think that's an excellent use of the data. Percentages again for a Parr Street. Yes, it's 11% in, just remind myself, 11% in the Sussex profile and 3% in the Surrey profile. But as I say, that is the catchment as a whole. So they do appear in higher proportions when you start looking at ward level. So once you've received the report, it's worth looking at your local wards to see who's sitting in those local areas who perhaps, you know, are not so prominent in the catchment as a whole. Any other thoughts or questions at this point?
Can't see any hands up.
No, that's fine. So thinking again about how you're going to use that data, the things to consider, as I say, are thinking about, you know, where you might want to focus in your catchment area. So, you know, where is there opportunity to increase footfall by encouraging more of the same sorts of audience that you already have, where you might reach out to entirely new audiences that you're not engaging at the moment, so those underrepresented groups, and where you might deepen the relationships with your existing audiences in terms of developing them as supporters and advocates for your offer. And I think one of the key things is to think about, you know, in what ways is your offer meaningful for those different groups and in what different ways? So it's not necessarily about delivering different activities for different types of visitor, different types of audience and participant, but how it's actually presented to them. So for example, the lower engaged groups will need perhaps more practical information. They like to see pictures of people like them engaging with the activity, whereas the higher engaged groups are more drawn to well-known names perhaps, or you know, they'll respond more to images of collections or artworks and things like that. So it's about thinking, what are the routes to engagement with those different groups, and what might you need to change or tweak in order to draw them in.
We've got a question from Helen in the chat. It was, any other tips for how the data can be used that have not been mentioned? For example, what kinds of plans, policies, stakeholder relationships, that sort of thing that it might be useful for?
Sure. Well, I think, you know, all of this data can be used to inform lots of different strategic planning. And I think by putting your audiences at the center of your planning, whether it's, you know, your business plan or any other, you know, sort of fundraising strategies and things like that, it can really bring all of that together, because often those priorities can seem to compete with one another, but actually you can use an effective audience strategy to meet all of those different priorities by engaging different audiences, which will help you achieve against your different strategies that you need to deliver on.
Thank you. And we've got another question from Rohan. So lucky Rohan seems pretty comfortable with working with this kind of database and could probably extract a specific data set that suited their needs. But does a subscription include sort tools or ways to extract specific sets? So I think that might be something different, because we're providing this report free of charge to our museums and to use as they wish. I imagine that might be something further that the audience says you agency could provide, Jackie, maybe?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we have lots of bespoke services where we can look at different data sets and break them down and analyze them and report on them in different ways. But there's also some free resources on our website in different ways to use your area profiles. So I think I would point you in the direction of those first, and then more than happy to have a conversation about what might be useful in terms of doing other things with the area profile reports. But yeah, you know, it's delivered to you as an Excel workbook, so you can manipulate the data that's in there in lots of different ways. Before I share the slide set as well, I'll put an additional link to those resources in the slide set so that you have access to those quite easily as well. And I think also when you're developing your strategies, it's really important to think about why it's important for you as an organisation to engage with a particular audience group. How does it help you deliver on your vision or your purpose? Because particularly when you're looking at funding applications, funders may have, you know, particular criteria that they're looking for. And the important thing is to find the opportunities that align with your own strategic objectives, because that means that anything you put in place is more likely to be sustainable and have a long-term impact on engagement with those audiences, rather than delivering things project by project, which, you know, might be great for the audience who's engaged through the period that that project is live for, but if they then came back 6 months later, they wouldn't find anything in the offer for them. So thinking about how it builds into your how your audience development is incorporated in your kind of day-to-day delivery as well will help mean that it's more sustainable, and that any investment that you put in terms of time and resources is actually, you know, it has a long-term legacy. And finally, this is just a summary really about how to take all that data and help turn it into your strategic planning. And a lot of that is to do with, as I say, layering up all of the information that you have, thinking about how engagement with different groups of different types of audience will help you achieve different objectives within your overall planning. And also, you know, not everything has to be for everybody. So, you know, if you have a particular activity and it's targeted at a particular type of audience, it doesn't mean that you're not interested in everybody else, and it doesn't mean that other things in your programming and your offer might appeal to those different audiences. It is about just being more targeted, because if you're, you know, if you're thinking about, oh, you know, this is open to everybody, nobody wants to feel exclusive, but that doesn't mean you can't take a targeted approach to particular strands of activity to give people the routes in that they need to encourage them to engage. You will get other audiences as well, but this is about being really mindful of who the audience is that you want to engage with and why it might be meaningful for them as well. And also, I mean, I'm aware that a lot of museums and heritage sites particularly work with very small teams, often a team of one who is responsible for everything. But where you do have different people who have responsibility for different areas of activity, whether that's marketing or programming or learning and participation, you know, school groups, all those different activities. You know, if you've got an on-site cafe and a shop and so on, and you have people who are responsible for that, it's really important to bring everybody together to think about your audiences and explore the information that you have, so that you have a shared understanding of what that information is telling you and how you can use it. Because again, that's going to help you succeed, and make sure that your approaches are embedded across your organisation and everything's consistent and moving in the same direction. I'll just flick through these final slides and then I'll stop sharing so we can have a final catch up and see if anybody has any other questions. So these are our audience agency and my direct contact details. Please do feel free to get in touch with us. I'm aware that, you know, this is a lot of information to throw at you in a relatively short space of time. Behind all of this, there is further information and resources available from our website. These are all free. So here are some links to other things you might find useful in supporting you to use this data effectively, including the participation monitor that I mentioned. We are regularly updating our reports and digests and insight that's emerging from that monitor. That's all available from the website, so I would encourage you to have a look at that. It does give you a really good understanding of how people have been impacted by COVID in terms of their arts and cultural activity, and then some further sources and resources and some case studies that you might find useful